Story 1. The Room with No Windows. I remember driving late through the Blue Ridge that night. The rain slicking the road and making the headlights bounce off the slick asphalt like ghosts chasing me down the winding curves. I'd been on the road for hours, exhausted, and when I saw the small roadside inn, I nearly swerved off the road in relief. It wasn't much, peeling paint, a sagging porch, but it promised shelter, and right then, that was all I wanted. The woman who ran it appeared from the doorway before I even could knock, hunched and quiet, with dark circles under her eyes that made her look perpetually on the verge of sleep. She didn't smile or greet me warmly. She just nodded, said a few words I barely caught, and led me down the narrow hallway. The air smelled of damp wood and something else, an old, clinging musk that didn't seem to belong to any person in particular. She opened the door to my room, and I stopped for a moment, noticing its strange angles. It was tucked at the end of the hall, the kind of corner room that felt almost like it had been squeezed in as an afterthought. There were no windows, and the wallpaper was heavy, patterned with ivy that seemed to crawl along the walls under the dim light. The bed sagged in the middle, and a single lamp flickered faintly, throwing shadows that moved like clouds across the room. I set down my bag, and the woman gave me a curt nod before retreating, leaving me alone. The silence that followed wasn't comforting. It was thick and expectant, as if the room itself were holding its breath. I tried to make myself settle in, unpacking a few things, but every small sound echoed oddly. The creak of the bed frame, the soft thud of my shoes on the carpet, the wind rattling the thin metal of the exterior shutters. I told myself I was imagining it when the breathing started. At first, I thought it was me, maybe my own exhaustion playing tricks. But when I stopped moving, the sound kept going. Slow, measured, deliberate. It didn't belong to me. My chest tightened, and I realized I couldn't leave. The door wouldn't budge. I twisted the knob, slammed against it, but it was as if the room had grown into itself. Pressing back, refusing my exit. Heart hammering, I pressed my ear to the wall. At first, there was only a low, almost imperceptible hum, like the house settling. Then I heard it, soft, fragmented whispers threading through the plaster. I couldn't make out the words, but the cadence was unmistakably human, deliberate, watching. My skin prickled. I stepped back, shaking my head, telling myself I was imagining it, that the hours of driving had finally broken me down. But the whispers persisted, curling around my name without ever speaking it aloud. I sat on the edge of the bed, listening. The wallpaper, that dense, ivy-patterned paper, seemed to pulse under my gaze. At first, it was subtle, like the shadows shifting with a flicker of movement. Then I could swear the vines twisted and writhed beneath the surface, as if something moved behind it, stretching out, waiting. The air grew heavier with each minute, pressing down like a weight, making it harder to breathe. I wanted to call out, to scream, to get someone, anyone, but the words stuck in my throat. The room felt endless, like it stretched beyond the walls, beyond the floor, beyond the ceiling. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time had become irrelevant. Every small noise, the rustle of the sheets, the scrape of the lamp against the dresser, echoed like a footstep in a cavern. I tried to distract myself, telling myself it was just the inn settling, that the house was old and everything had a sound. But then, the breathing changed. It wasn't just slow and measured anymore. It shifted closer, circling me. I could hear it behind the bed, under the bed, moving with a rhythm that matched my own quickening pulse. I tried to stand, tried to move, but my legs felt glued to the floor. Panic rose in me, hot and sharp, burning my chest. I crouched beside the bed, pressing my face to the cold carpet, straining to hear. The whispers came again, now more distinct, more urgent, like someone trying to communicate through a wall of thick stone. I couldn't make sense of them, but I understood one thing. I was not alone. Not really. Something shared this space with me. Something that had waited, patient and silent, for anyone foolish enough to wander into its corner of the world. I thought about trying to escape again, to force the door open, but the effort seemed useless. The room didn't want me to leave. Sleep didn't come, not fully. I drifted in fragments, waking to the same oppressive weight, the same quiet presence. At times I would convince myself I had imagined everything, that exhaustion had conjured the breathing, the whispers, the pulsing wallpaper. But then I'd see the shadows moving in the corners, see the faint ripple where the vines seemed to writhe beneath the paper. I never turned on the lamp. Light seemed irrelevant here, almost dangerous in its clarity. By dawn, I was trembling, the weight of the night still pressing down. I waited until the woman appeared to unlock the door, offering no comfort or apology, only a tired nod. When I stepped out into the hallway, the sunlight struck the walls, bright and ordinary, but I could still feel it, the presence, lingering, patient. I didn't look back at the room, didn't ask for my bag. I walked straight to my car, hands shaking on the wheel, and drove off, the mountains quiet behind me. Even now, months later, I can't remember the inn's name. I can't place its location, though I've driven that stretch countless times since. But every time I close my eyes in a dark room, I feel it there. The weight of unseen eyes, the whispers threading along the walls, the pulse beneath the wallpaper that no one else can see. I tell myself it was exhaustion, that it was imagination, but deep down, I know some part of me stayed there in that room, waiting. I've never stayed in a corner room without windows again. Every time I enter an unfamiliar place, I check for doors, for angles, for those spaces that seem to stretch beyond the normal walls of a house. And sometimes, when the wind is right, I can hear it again, faint at first, then clearer. The slow, deliberate breathing of a presence that doesn't belong to this world, calling from behind a wall I cannot reach. It's a memory that feels alive, almost as if it waits for me to return, and I don't think I ever will. Story 2. The Bell That Wouldn't Stop Ringing. I was driving through the Blue Ridge that night when the storm hit, sudden and brutal, with sheets of rain hammering the windshield and the wipers struggling to keep pace. The road twisted and climbed between the trees, and every shadow seemed to loom larger than it should, the trunks bending in the wind like bent spines. I'd been on the road for hours, exhausted, and when I saw the inn tucked against the hillside, I almost drove past without realizing it. The sign was faded, the paint peeling, and the porch sagged under decades of neglect, but it promised shelter. Relief washed over me, and I parked under the flickering light by the entrance, sloshing through the puddles to the front door. Inside, the air was warm but heavy, smelling faintly of mildew and wood smoke. The man at the front desk was older, thin, with a lined face and eyes that barely met mine. He moved slowly, deliberately, as if his limbs remembered how to function from habit alone. He handed me a small brass bell, worn at the edges, and said in a voice barely above a whisper, "If you need anything, ring it." There was no explanation, no mention of a phone or other stuff, just the bell. I laughed quietly, a little unease creeping up my spine, and took it with me to my room at the end of the long, narrow hallway. The room was small, furnished simply, a bed, a dresser, a chair, and a single lamp that cast long shadows across the walls. I set the bell on the nightstand and tried to settle in, hoping sleep would come quickly after the long drive. But hours passed, and I woke to the sound of the bell. At first, I thought I had dropped it in my sleep, but when I opened my eyes it was on the nightstand exactly where I'd left it. The sound came again, clear and deliberate, echoing off the walls. I held my breath, half expecting to see someone in the doorway, but the room was empty. My pulse quickened, and I grabbed the bell, thinking maybe the wind had shifted, or some part of the inn had shifted with it. I took it downstairs to the front desk, hoping the man could explain. The lobby was empty, cold, and silent. I set the bell on the counter and waited. The man didn't appear. I felt a prickle of panic and decided to return to my room, thinking maybe exhaustion had finally frayed my nerves. When I opened the door, the bell was back on the nightstand, gleaming faintly under the lamp. My heart jumped into my throat. I tried to convince myself it was some trick of memory, but the air in the room had changed. It felt thicker, like the walls were pressing in, waiting for me to make a mistake. That night, I barely slept. Every time I drifted, the bell would ring, sharp and insistent, echoing through the corners of the room. I would wake, the shadows dancing along the walls, and the sound seemed to draw closer each time, not fading into distance but tightening around me, circling my bed. When the lamp flickered, I thought I saw movement in the shadows, something shifting just beyond my peripheral vision. I told myself it was the storm, the wind through the cracked siding, the long hours of driving. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that. I tried sitting up, tried shaking off the fear, but the ringing was insistent, ringing without pattern, without reason. My hands clutched the bell, but it didn't stop. Each time it sounded, the lights flickered violently, casting the room in uneven pools of brightness, shadows stretching and shrinking like they were alive. I placed the bell on the floor, backed into a corner, and stared, listening. The sound no longer seemed to be from the bell itself. It came from everywhere, the corners of the room, beneath, the bed, along the ceiling. It was closer now, pressing into my ears, vibrating the walls, and with every pulse of sound, I felt the air grow heavier, suffocating in its weight. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. I stopped keeping track. The storm outside had died down, leaving only the faint rustle of trees against the window. Yet the bell continued, never pausing, never weakening. I thought about fleeing, about throwing open the door and running down the hall, but when I tried, my legs felt like lead. Something in the room held me in place, a pressure that wasn't physical but real, insistent. My thoughts spun in panic. What was I supposed to do? Was it the inn, the man? Or had I simply crossed some boundary I didn't understand? I sat there until dawn, trembling, barely breathing, every nerve screaming. When the first light crept across the floorboards, the ringing stopped. Silence fell, heavy and complete, but it wasn't a relief. It was quiet in a way that made the room feel like it was waiting for me to make the next mistake. I dared not touch the bell, which now sat quietly on the nightstand, polished and ordinary in the morning light. I dressed quickly and headed down to leave, expecting the man at the front desk to be there, waiting. But the lobby was empty. No footsteps, no voices, only the faint smell of damp wood and old smoke. I didn't stop the car to look back. I didn't even glance at the inn as I drove away, the mountains rising silently behind me. But for weeks afterward, I felt it in my apartment, in the quiet hours of the night. The echo of that bell, soft at first, almost polite, then insistent ringing, as if it had followed me from that room at the end of the hall. Sometimes, in the dead of night, I swear I can hear it again, rising from corners of my apartment where there are no tables, no bells, just the dark, waiting, patient and unyielding. I've never stayed in another inn without asking about the rooms, the history, the staff, anything to reassure myself that what I experienced wasn't possible, but it lingers anyway. I remember the way the brass gleamed under the flickering lamp, the way the shadows twisted along the walls, the way the air itself seemed to hold me down and watch me, even now. I wake in the dark, half expecting the bell to ring, to shatter the silence and remind me that some places hold on to you long after you leave, that some nights follow you across the miles and into your own home. The storm faded, the mountains grew still, but that night remains. I don't understand it. I can't explain why the bell rang on its own, why the lights flickered with every chime, why the sound seemed to move closer with each pulse. I don't know if the man at the desk ever existed outside my exhaustion, or if the inn itself was designed to trap some part of me I didn't want to leave behind. All I know is that every time I hear the faintest ring or the scrape of metal in an empty room, I feel the weight of that night. And I remember that I was not alone, not truly, and that some things follow quietly, patiently, until you can feel them, not just hear them. Story 3: Shadows in the Dining Hall. I pulled off the mountain road just as the last light was fading, the trees around me whispering in the wind and the sky turning the color of bruised iron. I had been driving all day, and when I spotted the inn, small, weathered, and looking like it hadn't welcomed a traveler in decades, I felt a strange mix of relief and unease. The sign above the door was peeling, the letters half gone, but a warm glow spilled from the windows, the kind of light that promises shelter even if it comes from a place that time has largely forgotten. I parked on the uneven gravel and stepped onto the creaking porch, the air cool and damp, smelling faintly of wet leaves and old wood. Inside, the inn was quiet. The kind of silence that presses on your ears until you feel the absence of sound as something heavy and real. The wallpaper was peeling at the corners, revealing layers of faded patterns beneath, and the scent of mildew and long unwashed fabric hung in the air. A single lamp on the front desk flickered, throwing half the lobby into shadow. The innkeeper appeared from somewhere in the back, an older woman with grey-streaked hair pulled tight and eyes that seemed to measure me with a quiet calculation. She nodded and spoke in a voice low and deliberate, asking if I would be staying for supper. I agreed, though part of me felt odd at the thought of dining alone in a place so empty, so still. She led me to the dining hall, and I stopped short when I saw it. The room was set for dozens of guests, but no one sat at the tables. Plates gleamed under the soft candlelight, glasses caught the fire's reflection, and silverware lay carefully aligned as though awaiting company that never arrived. I felt a chill run down my spine. She insisted with that same quiet insistence that I sit and eat, and though I hesitated, I found myself at a table near the hearth. The flicker of the flames made the shadows dance across the walls, long and thin, twisting like fingers reaching toward me. As I ate, I thought I saw movement in the corners of the room, at first subtle, almost imperceptible, like the shadows themselves were shifting in ways firelight shouldn't allow. I stopped chewing, held my fork mid-air, and tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, the tricks of light and shadow playing on peeling wallpaper. But the longer I stared, the more certain I became that the movement had purpose. Shadows gathered along the walls, stretching, leaning, pointing subtly toward my chair. They whispered to one another in a soundless murmur, and the air felt heavy, thick, with a presence I couldn't name. I looked toward the innkeeper, intending to ask a question, but she had vanished. There was no sound of footsteps, no soft shuffle of her slippers across the floor. One moment she was there. The next, the room was empty except for me and the shadows. My pulse quickened, and I tried to rise, to leave. But something in the room kept me rooted, pressing at the edges of my awareness like an unseen weight. The shadows continued to gather, forming shapes that my mind refused to fully define, circling my chair as if they were waiting for something from me. I forced myself to take a deep breath and focus on the meal, but every bite felt meaningless. Every sound of the crackling fire amplified. I could feel the shadow's presence at my edges, shifting, brushing against the space around me in ways that should have been impossible. I could sense them, vaguely human, vaguely watching, leaning closer. And though I didn't see faces, I felt the weight of their attention like a hand on my shoulder. The room felt smaller with every passing moment, the ceiling pressing down, the walls tightening, until the only space left was the narrow circle of light around my plate. Hours, or maybe only minutes, passed in this suspended, oppressive state. I tried to speak aloud, to call for the innkeeper, to demand an explanation, but no sound emerged. The shadows didn't move away. Instead, they shifted closer with a deliberate patience, circling my chair, leaning toward me. I could feel their intent, a cold, observing, almost calculating focus that seemed entirely human but impossibly wrong. I tried to rise again, my legs trembling, but the moment I stood, the circle of shadows contracted slightly, like the room itself had pulled against me. I sat back down, hands gripping the table, heart hammering in my chest. The candlelight flickered violently, and for a moment I thought I saw a shadow separate from the others, moving deliberately toward the plate in front of me, then stopping just short. I blinked, and it merged back into the rest, indistinguishable from the rest of the movement. I could feel their silent communication, the whispering at the edges of perception, and my mind refused to name it, refused to acknowledge what was happening. But I knew I was not dining alone. I realized I had been led here, somehow, not for supper, but to witness, to experience, to sit with something that lingered in the corners of this forgotten inn. I finished my meal mechanically, swallowing each bite with difficulty, my eyes constantly scanning the darkened edges of the room. The fire's warmth felt meaningless, the taste of food bland and heavy in my mouth. I thought I heard footsteps again, tentative, soft, almost human. But when I looked up, the shadows shifted and lengthened, no one visible. Panic pressed against my chest, a rising tide that made my breath short and shallow. I wanted to run, to leave, but the weight of the room, the insistence of those watching shapes, rooted me in place. By the time the fire began to die down and the flickering candlelight softened, I felt the shadows settling into a slower, more deliberate motion. They lingered, circling, pointing, whispering without sound, as though acknowledging that I had stayed, that I had eaten, that I had obeyed some unspoken rule I didn't understand. I rose slowly, careful not to provoke them, and made my way to the door. The hall beyond was silent, the innkeeper nowhere in sight, and I moved quickly to my room, locking the door behind me. Sleep eluded me, the sense of being watched settling deep in my chest. Morning came pale and grey, the mountains silent except for the whisper of wind through the trees. I packed quickly, avoiding the dining hall, avoiding any glance at the shadows that had haunted me, and left the inn without speaking to anyone. I drove down the winding roads, the images of that hall, the long tables, the plates set for absent guests, the shadows circling me, etched into my mind. Even now, months later, I can see them when I close my eyes, feel the cold brush of attention at the edges of awareness. I've avoided mountain inns since then, wary of the empty rooms, wary of the spaces set for strangers that never arrive. I don't understand what I saw, what I felt, or why it seemed so deliberate, so purposeful. But I remember every flicker of light, every whisper in the corners, every movement of those shadows as they gathered silently around my chair. They never spoke, never revealed themselves fully, but I knew they were there, waiting for me, and some part of me, terrified and unwilling, wants to return. Even now I catch myself imagining the room, the shadows, the weight of being observed in a space meant to be welcoming. The memory has a clarity that is almost physical, pressing against my ribs, tightening my chest, and reminding me that some nights, some places, carry more than history. They carry a presence that lingers long after the fire is out, long after the doors are closed, long after we've left. Story 5. The Mirror in Room 6. I remember driving into the Blue Ridge Mountains late that evening, the sky bruised purple and black, with rain drumming against my windshield in uneven bursts. I was exhausted from the road, my eyes gritty, and my stomach twisted with the familiar churn of hunger and fatigue. When the inn appeared at a sharp bend in the road, it felt like it had been waiting for me, shrouded in mist and half lit by the glow of a single lamp swinging weakly on a rusted bracket. Its facade was plain, almost stubbornly unremarkable, weathered clapboards peeling like old scabs, windows clouded with grime, but something about it called to me, and I was too weary to argue. I parked my car on the uneven gravel and trudged to the door, my boots crunching through scattered leaves. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of old wood and damp plaster. The lobby was narrow and dim, furnished with furniture that had clearly survived decades of neglect. Behind a counter sat the innkeeper, an older man whose face seemed carved from shadow and worry lines, a slow smile revealing teeth dulled by time. "Room 6, he said, handing me a brass key and gesturing toward the stairs. "Don't mind the mirror, it's old, it's seen much, nothing to worry about." His voice was soft, almost too soft, as if he were sharing a secret I wasn't meant to hear. I nodded, my exhaustion blunting my curiosity, and made my way to the staircase. Room 6 was at the far end of the second floor. The hallway smelled faintly of mildew and mothballs, and the floorboards groaned beneath each step. My hand trembled slightly as I turned the key in the lock, and when the door creaked open, I found a room that seemed deliberately plain, except for one dominating feature. An antique mirror stretched nearly from floor to ceiling on the wall opposite the bed. Its surface gleamed despite the dim light, and it reflected the room with a clarity that made my skin prickle. I thought about draping it with the small towel I found on the chair, and did so almost instinctively, tugging the fabric over the glass until it hung unevenly, but fully covering the mirror. I didn't want to stare too long, didn't want to feel that subtle unease curling in my stomach. I unpacked my bag and tried to settle in, though sleep felt elusive. Every time I passed the mirror, I felt the smallest lag in my reflection. Just a subtle hesitation, a flicker that I convinced myself was my imagination. By the time I forced myself into bed, I was drained but tense, the anticipation of rest mixed with the vague but persistent impression that the mirror was watching, that it was alive in some way I could not name. The inn was quiet, the occasional groan of settling timber and the whisper of wind through broken panes forming a lullaby of unease. Sometime after midnight, I woke to the faint sound of shifting metal. My eyes, still adjusting to the dark, caught the edge of the mirror reflecting moonlight, and I froze. The towel I had draped across it had been pulled down, hanging limp at the sides. My heart hammered. The reflection of my room was intact, but it wasn't quite me I saw. My body lay rigid beneath the sheets, and in the mirror, my figure stood upright, facing me. For a moment I convinced myself I was dreaming, that exhaustion had twisted reality. I blinked rapidly, forcing my eyes to focus, but the image remained, the reflection watching me with an uncanny stillness, as if it had been waiting. Panic began to rise. I told myself it was a trick of the light, the moon casting a skewed shadow, the angle of the furniture, anything but the truth. I dared not move, and the minutes stretched unbearably. My reflection tilted its head, almost imperceptibly, and for the first time I felt that the glass was no longer just a surface, but a space separate from the room, a place where something else existed. I forced my eyes closed, willing the vision away. When I opened them again, the towel was back, draped carefully as if nothing had happened, but the memory of that still figure lingered, a weight pressing down on my chest. Sleep did not come. Each creak of the floorboards, each sigh of the old inn made me jolt awake. I imagined shadows moving at the periphery of the mirror, subtle disturbances in the reflection that didn't belong to me. I considered leaving, grabbing my bag. But the storm outside had grown heavier, the wind lashing the roof with an angry persistence, and I hesitated, unsure if running would bring safety or simply another terror on the road. In the early hours, I swore I saw it again. The mirror seemed slightly askew, just a fraction of an inch tilted as if leaning toward the bed. I froze, listening to the silence, counting the tiny sounds. The pulse of my own blood in my ears, the whisper of rain, and the almost imperceptible hum of the glass. I wanted to speak, to call out, but my voice was caught in my throat. I couldn't distinguish what was real from what was conjured by my own fear. When I finally dared to peek again, the reflection was normal. My body lying asleep as expected, but the sense of being watched persisted, gnawing at the edges of reason. Morning came sluggishly, heavy and grey. The storm had passed, leaving a damp chill that seeped through the walls. I packed hurriedly, my hands shaking, avoiding the mirror entirely, and descended the stairs without looking back. The innkeeper was at the counter and he offered a slow, knowing smile. "Room 6 isn't to everyone's liking," he said. I nodded, not trusting my voice, and left without asking further questions, the gravel crunching sharply beneath my boots as though marking an escape. I tried to tell myself it had been the long drive, the isolation, the storm playing tricks on my mind. Yet every time I recall the shape in that mirror, the deliberate, calm way it watched me, I feel the same tightening in my chest, the same cold sweat crawling along my spine. Weeks later, I told a friend about it, expecting laughter, dismissal, but instead he simply nodded slowly. "Some of those old places," he said, "they remember. You don't always leave what you came with." Even now, when I pass reflective surfaces in dim light, I hesitate. The memory clings, stubborn and insistent. I can't shake the feeling that something remains in that room, waiting, patient. Sometimes at night, when my apartment is silent except for the hum of the city outside, I swear I see a faint delay in my reflection, a subtle hesitation that makes my stomach tighten. I've tried to rationalize it, chalk it up to sleep deprivation or stress, but logic feels thin against the memory of standing over my own body, seeing myself look back with calm and intent. I never returned to that inn. I haven't even driven through that section of the mountains again, and yet, in my mind, I can still hear the faint scrape of the mirror's frame, the subtle shift of glass against wood, the quiet, patient presence waiting for the next visitor. Friends ask why I get tense near mirrors, why I avoid hotel rooms with antique furnishings, and I tell them a vague story of a storm, of exhaustion, of a mirror that seemed odd. But they don't know the truth, that something inside the glass, however I choose to define it, watches, waits, and remembers. And sometimes when I wake in the night, I half expect the mirror to be there, draped in its towel, hiding what it wants me to see. I close my eyes tightly, willing sleep to come. But even in that darkness, I feel the weight of the memory pressing down, a cold, unyielding certainty that whatever I encountered in room 6 wasn't just reflection. It was something patient, something deliberate, and something I was never meant to leave behind. The thought lingers like a shadow at the edge of my consciousness, quiet and insistent, reminding me that some memories are not merely remembered. They follow you, unseen, into every quiet room, every dim hallway, every mirror that catches your eye. I don't tell this story often. I don't like to speak of it aloud because speaking gives it shape, and giving it shape makes it real again. Yet it has never left me. Not in the mountains, not in the city, not in the lonely stretches of highway that run through the dark hollows of my mind. I still feel the weight of that mirror, still feel the delay in my own reflection when I pass a glass. I know that what happened in that room wasn't imagination, wasn't fatigue, wasn't some simple trick of light or shadow. I know it, the same way you know the quiet of the woods is never truly empty. And that knowledge is heavier than any storm I've ever driven through, even now. I sometimes lie awake in the dark, listening to the faint hum of the city, and I imagine the mirror leaning ever so slightly toward my bed. I imagine the still figure, calm and patient, its eyes waiting for mine to meet them. I don't look, I can't, but I feel it in the quiet, in the pause between breaths, in the subtle hesitation of my own reflection. I feel it, and I know that whatever watches from glass, whatever lingers in those rooms long abandoned, does not forget. It waits, and it remembers. And I am certain, in a way I cannot explain or shake, that some part of it followed me when I left. I have tried to leave the mountains behind, to leave that night behind, but I have never been able to. I drive past forests and old inns with a vigilance that borders on obsession, and I avoid any room with mirrors that stretch too high, that gleam too clearly. Still, when the light catches glass just so, I see it. The delay, the shadow, the slight tilt. I see it and feel the same cold dread that first night in room 6, that quiet certainty that some things in this world are patient, deliberate, and hidden just beyond the edges of perception. And so I live with it, carrying the memory of that mirror, carrying the weight of what it showed me and what it left behind. I cannot say what it was, cannot define it, cannot reason it away. I only know that it watches, waits, and remembers. And that is enough to make me afraid, always afraid, of the reflection staring back from any mirror, any glass, anywhere. Story 6. The Guest Book with No Names. I remember the first time I noticed the inn was odd, and not just the kind of odd you get with old Appalachian lodgings. I had been driving late along a back road that wound through the ridges, the headlights catching glimpses of gnarled oaks and the occasional flicker of a creek in the moonlight. It was the kind of place where GPS signals go dead and your phone battery seems to drain faster than usual. I didn't mean to stop, but the sign, wooden, weathered, barely hanging from its posts, read simply Silver Hollow Inn. Something about it compelled me to pull off the road, and before I could talk myself out of it, I had parked. The building looked abandoned from the outside, paint flaking in long, curling strips, the porch sagging like it might give way under its own weight. The windows were dirty, but I could see the dim glow of a single lantern swinging inside, dust motes caught in its light. The door creaked when I pushed it open, a sound like bones grinding together, and a draft carried the scent of old wood, dust, and something faintly sour, like fermented apples gone wrong. The lobby was narrow, furnished with an armchair whose stuffing peeked through torn fabric, a small desk with a lamp that flickered as though it struggled to stay alive. Behind it sat the innkeeper, an older man, thin, his hair a salt and pepper mess, eyes sharp but tired. He didn't smile when I entered, he simply gestured for me to come closer. "I don't get many visitors," he said. His voice was soft, almost swallowed by the shadows clinging to the corners of the room. "Room 6 is yours if you like. Mind the guest book." He held out a small, leather-bound book, its cover cracked, the spine frayed. I took it and flipped it open, expecting to see the usual list of names, dates, maybe a scribbled comment here and there. But the pages were strange. Every line on every page was blank, stretching back by the look of it decades. No ink smudges, no notes, not even a signature I could recognize. It was as if nobody had ever stayed here before. I haven't seen a blank book like this before, I said. Few have, he murmured. Sign if you'd like. It's just tradition. His eyes didn't meet mine. I signed, hesitant. The pen scratched across the page, the ink thick, a little uneven. My hand shook, though I didn't know why. I closed the book, set it on the desk, and followed him up the narrow staircase to my room. The hall smelled of mothballs and something iron-like, faint but undeniable. Each step creaked beneath my weight, echoing as if the building itself was sighing under my intrusion. The room was simple: a bed, a chair, a small dresser, and a window looking out toward the forested slope behind the inn. The lamp on the nightstand gave off a warm, flickering light, but shadows pooled in the corners, long and still. I set the guestbook on the dresser, curious but trying not to think too much about its emptiness. By the time I had unpacked a few things, the inn was silent. No footsteps, no creaks from the floors above or below, just the occasional groan of settling wood. I tried to shake off a rising unease and decided to lie down, closing my eyes to rest after the long drive. Hours later, though it might have been only minutes, I woke to a soft, scratching sound. At first, I thought it was the wind or a branch scraping the side of the building, but the sound was deliberate, repeated, like claws or fingernails dragging across wood. I held my breath, straining to listen. It came from outside the room. My door was closed, latched, but I could hear the rhythm, patient, deliberate, almost impatient. I got up and opened the door. The hall was empty, as I expected, but the guestbook lay on the floor in front of the door. A pen rested diagonally across its open page. I felt a cold trickle of fear run down my spine. Hesitantly, I knelt and looked at the page. My name was there, written in shaky, uneven letters, the ink dark against the yellowed paper. I didn't recognize the handwriting. It was mine, I thought at first, but not exactly. The letters slanted too much. The lines curved unnaturally, a kind of mimicry, like someone had watched me write, studied my hand, and reproduced it imperfectly. My chest tightened. I wanted to call out, wanted to scream, but no words came. The scratching stopped, as if it had heard my heartbeat, my rising panic. I picked up the book, clutching it to my chest, and went back inside the room. I locked the door, pressed my back against it, and tried to convince myself I was imagining it. Tired nerves, maybe the lonely isolation of driving through the mountains. Morning came pale and cold, the kind of grey light that makes shadows stretch and sag unnaturally. I dressed quickly, desperate to leave, and went to the car. But when I looked inside, my stomach dropped. The guestbook was on the front seat, open to the page with my name, underlined 3 times. I hadn't touched it, hadn't moved it from the dresser in the room, yet it was there, waiting. I sat in the driver's seat, gripping the wheel, staring at the book. My hands shook. I didn't look at the inn again, didn't want to see its peeling paint, the sagging porch, or the figure of the innkeeper in the shadows. I started the car and drove, the mountains rising on either side like silent sentinels, watching, patient. I never opened the book again, never signed another page, but sometimes, when the nights are long and the forest whispers in the wind, I remember that trembling script, those shaky letters of my own name that weren't really mine, and I wonder if the inn is still there, waiting for the next traveler, the next signature, the next quiet scratching outside a lonely room, The way the mountains slope in the Blue Ridge, with their dense forests and hidden hollows. You realize quickly how easy it is to vanish. The Silver Hollow Inn, if it's still standing, is the kind of place that seems to stretch time, bend it in ways you don't understand until it's too late. I tell myself it was just a trick of old wood, ink, and exhaustion, but the memory lingers in ways that feel heavier than the coldest winter night. There's a weight in knowing that someone or something can imitate you perfectly, can leave you with proof of your presence where you never went. Even now, when I drive through the mountains, I avoid side roads that twist and disappear into hollows. I pass the weathered signs, the lonely cabins, and I remember that empty guestbook, the pen laid neatly across it. My name staring back at me like a warning. Sometimes I swear I hear scratching in the dark, far off in the hills, and I wonder if it is the inn, or if it is me, being reminded that it was never just a place I stayed. It was a place that stayed with me. I can't explain why the book moved, why my name appeared before I could touch it, or why the innkeeper never answered when I called after him. I only know the feeling, the heavy, impossible certainty that something patient, hidden, and watching exists in the hollows of the Blue Ridge. And that sometimes when you sign your name, you're not just leaving it behind. You're bringing it with you, whether you like it or not. The mountains are still there, and the forest still waits. And I still remember that guestbook, open, empty lines stretching back decades, and my name written where it shouldn't have been. The sense of being followed, watched, recorded. It never truly leaves. I have tried to tell myself it was exhaustion, imagination, the isolation of the roads I traveled. But even in the daylight, even when the trees are silent, I know better. The hollow keeps its secrets, and it doesn't care if you leave. I never stayed for a second night, and I never will. But the memory of that inn, of the guestbook, of the shaking letters underlined in dark ink, haunts me like the softest scratching against a wooden floor in a silent room. I tell people about the Blue Ridge, the hidden roads, the isolated cabins, and they laugh or nod politely. They don't understand. You don't understand until you've opened a guestbook with no names, only to find your own, and realized it was never really yours to leave behind. I can still feel the weight of it in my hands, the brittle pages, the pen laid neatly across it as if waiting for me to return. I can't shake the image of the hall, silent and waiting, and the soft, deliberate scratching that meant I was never alone. And sometimes, just sometimes, I think I see it again in the corner of my vision, a room with an open book, yellowed pages, and a name written before I even arrived. It is a memory that refuses to let me go, a shadow of the Blue Ridge that follows me down every lonely back road, whispering that some places, some things, are not meant to be visited. I have driven thousands of miles since that night, through cities, through valleys, along highways crowded with headlights and noise. Yet no matter where I go, I can still feel it. That impossible certainty that the book exists somewhere, that my name exists somewhere, and that it will always be underlined, waiting, patient, unyielding, and watching. I never signed another guestbook after that, and I never will. And sometimes I wonder if the mountains themselves remember, if the forest keeps a record of those who pass through, quietly marking their names in places where only the patient, the silent, and the waiting can see. I think about the inn, about the empty lines stretching back decades, and I understand, with a chill that reaches into my bones, that some records are meant to follow you, even when you think you've left them behind. I keep driving, I keep moving, but the Blue Ridge, the hollow, and the guestbook remain, and every so often when the wind bends just right through the trees, I swear I hear that scratching again. Story 7. The Woman at the Stairwell. I remember the night I arrived at the inn like a shadow in my memory. Cold, damp, and humming with the silence of the mountains. The road up had been narrow and slick with recent rain, twisting through dark stands of firs and birch that leaned over me as if to whisper warnings. The inn itself was an aging structure, its paint flaking and windows dim with dirt. The sign creaked on its chain in the wind, though no one else seemed to stir. Inside, the air smelled of wood polish and mildew, of things long left undisturbed. The front desk was manned by an older woman whose smile felt forced, too tight, and her eyes kept darting toward the stairwell that led to the rooms above. She told me the inn was mostly empty for the season, but that I could take whatever room I liked. I had thought that reassuring until I followed the narrow hallway to the stairs and saw her glance over her shoulder in a way that felt almost like a warning. The stairs were steep and groaned under my weight, each step echoing in the hollow silence above. That was when I first saw her. She was at the landing, just beyond the final curve of the stairs, as if she had been waiting there for me. Her dress was torn and stained, fraying at the edges like it had caught on brambles or rough bark. Her hair was a wild tangle, strands sticking to her damp face and neck, and her skin had the pallor of someone who hadn't seen sunlight in days. She didn't move when I stopped, frozen, unsure of what I had seen. Her eyes, hollow, exhausted, unblinking, met mine and held them with a kind of patience that made me uneasy. There was no expression to soften the gaze, no plea or welcome, only a weariness that settled heavy in the pit of my stomach. I swallowed and tried to step past her quickly, my hand brushing the railing so hard I almost left marks. My footfalls were loud in the stillness, but when I glanced back as I reached the door to my room, the landing was empty. I should have felt relief, but instead there was an ache of wrongness, a sense that something had just shifted in the quiet, and I carried it with me as I closed the door and locked it. The room was modest. A bed, a dresser, a single flickering lamp, but there was an atmosphere to it, a weight that pressed in from the corners. I tried to tell myself I was imagining her, that the mountain's darkness and my own fatigue had played tricks. I told myself enough times to finally sit on the bed and pull off my soaked coat, but sleep did not come easily. When I did drift off, it was not in peace. Every time I stirred, I saw her again, just inside the doorway, as if waiting for me to notice her first. She never stepped closer, never blinked, never spoke, just waited. I would freeze, staring at her, my heart hammering against my ribs, until I forced my eyes shut again, and when I opened them, she was gone. The sensation became unbearable after a while. I tried moving the lamp closer to the door, tried tossing a chair in front of the threshold, even considered leaving in the middle of the night. But the road down the mountain was slick and treacherous, and the thought of slipping and breaking something, and finding myself alone with her in that case, kept me rooted to the bed. At some point, the wind picked up outside, rattling the window panes and setting the old sign on the porch to groan and scrape against its chain. The sound was like a chorus of voices, scraping, whispering, as if the mountains themselves were trying to tell me something. I couldn't sleep at all after that. Every creak of the floorboards, every distant rustle of the trees pressed my mind further into a state of paranoid awareness. I would lie awake, staring at the door, waiting for her to appear, and each time she did, it was just as before. Motionless, silent, eyes deep and hollow. There was no menace in her presence, but the weight of her waiting pressed down on me, a suffocating anticipation that made it impossible to move. Morning arrived in a grey drizzle, seeping through the cracks in the old windows and wetting the sill. I had slept in fits and starts, and when I finally stumbled to the stairs, I half expected to see her again at the landing, but it was empty. silent. I found the innkeeper in the kitchen cleaning a pan with deliberate slow strokes, and I tried to speak to her about what I had seen. She didn't flinch, didn't look startled. "The old woman?" she asked softly, almost like she knew I meant her. I nodded, though I realized I had no words to describe it properly. The innkeeper shook her head slowly. "She doesn't stay long," she said. "Just comes to watch. Most folks never notice. Some never leave." I felt my stomach drop, but I didn't press her. There was a weight behind her words, a quiet truth that seemed more dreadful than any explanation. I left breakfast untouched and went back to my room to gather my things, trying to convince myself that I had imagined it all, that fatigue and mountain air and the isolation had conjured a figure from my fears. But when I opened the door, the landing was empty, as it had been that morning. Yet I felt her there in the space, lingering in the corners of my vision. And then, as I stepped onto the stairs, I saw a dark mark on one of the steps, like a smear of mud, or perhaps the imprint of a shoe that had come down just before me. I froze, breath catching. I had checked the stairs when I arrived. They had been spotless, the only marks old and faded. I stepped back, heart hammering, and the mark seemed to pulse in the grey light, a subtle, terrible sign that she had been there recently. I didn't wait to see if she would appear again. I ran down the remaining steps, my hands scraping against the worn railing, and burst out into the damp morning air. The mountains were silent except for the distant wind, and the inn's windows seemed to watch me as I fled. The road back down was treacherous, muddy, and winding, but I didn't care. I only wanted the distance between me and that landing, between me and the hollow eyes of that woman who waited. I drove as quickly as I dared, the tires spitting mud, heart hammering so hard it seemed to echo against the hills. Even now, months later, I can't drive through the Blue Ridge without remembering that night. I see her sometimes in the edge of my vision, at the end of a hall, standing by a tree at a turn in the road, the same exhausted, hollow expression. I've tried to tell people what happened, but the story never comes out right. They want ghosts or curses or something they can understand, but that's not it. It wasn't about fear of the supernatural. It was the waiting, the silence, the patient, endless observation, something that exists outside of time, outside of reason, just there, and willing you to see it, to recognize it. Sometimes I lie awake at home and think I hear the creak of old stairs, a soft tap on the wooden floor, and I can feel her waiting just beyond the door, even though I know she isn't there. I think she followed me, not because she can, but because in some way the mountains themselves remembered, and in remembering, they keep her alive, patient, endless, waiting for someone else to notice, someone else to see. I've never returned to that inn. I've never wanted to. But still, when the wind rattles the windows at night, when the shadows stretch long and impossible across the walls, I remember the woman at the stairwell, and I know that somewhere up there, in the dark, she is still waiting. Her eyes were the kind that made you understand exhaustion in a new way, as if all the grief and weight of the world had pooled in them, and she simply had nowhere else to go. I sometimes wonder if she ever steps closer in some other person's story, or if she is doomed to linger like that, an eternal witness to our comings and goings, patient and silent. The thought clings to me, a low hum beneath every quiet moment. I do not know what she is, and I do not want to. All I know is the memory of those hollow eyes, the weight of her waiting, and the way the mountains seem to echo it long after I am gone. The fear I carry is not of the figure itself, but of the way it made me see the world differently, how it reminded me of the unseen, the quiet observations, the patient witnesses to our smallest movements. And sometimes, In the still hours before dawn, I wonder if she is watching still, waiting not for me, but for someone else, and whether they will recognize her before it's too late. I don't know. I don't want to know, but the memory does not leave, and in that there is a kind of sorrow that clings more tightly than any terror ever could. I never return to that inn. I will never return. But the mountains remember, and in remembering, so do I. Every time the wind rattles the windows and the shadows stretch too long, she is there, always there, waiting. Story 8. The Fire That Never Burned Out. I remember driving through the mountains as dusk fell, the road winding tight around hills slick with recent rain. I was chasing some quiet, a reprieve from the city, the kind of silence that presses against your ears until even your own breathing sounds loud. The inn appeared suddenly, tucked into a bend where the trees thinned and the land flattened just enough for a porch. Its sign creaked in the wind, Hollow Pines Inn. I slowed, expecting abandonment, maybe a note about vacancies or a boarded-up doorway. Instead, the porch light flickered weakly, and a man appeared in the doorway, a gaunt fellow with a thick coat and wary eyes that didn't smile when he nodded me inside. The lobby smelled of soot, old wood, and something faintly metallic, a scent that made the hairs on my neck stand up. There was a fireplace against the far wall, glowing with a steady orange warmth, though the hearth was bare. I stared for a long moment before asking about it. The innkeeper's answer was curt, almost a whisper. It's always burned. Always. He didn't elaborate, and I didn't push. There was something in the way his eyes lingered on the flames, a depth of attention that felt like watching someone else's memory unfold. My room was small, the walls paneled in pine that smelled faintly of mothballs and smoke. I dropped my bag, noticing that every shadow stretched unnaturally, thrown by the fireplace downstairs, which I could just barely see through the narrow window. I remember thinking the fire seemed to pulse, as if it were breathing, and a chill traced my spine. That night, I couldn't sleep. There's a certain sound mountains make when the wind moves through tall trees, low, whistling, almost vocal. And the inn amplified it, carrying it through the hallways like a warning. I lay on the bed, watching the thin sliver of moonlight that crept between the curtains, thinking I'd imagined the feeling of being watched. Then came the roar. It started low, a crackle under my door, and grew to a sound that seemed to push against the walls, vibrating in my chest. Smoke began to seep under the door, curling across the floor in lazy, grey spirals. I sat up, heart pounding, my hands shaking as the acrid scent filled my nostrils. I tried the doorknob. Locked. I thought about screaming, but the sound got caught in my throat, stifled by the smoke. Something primal surged in me, the old Appalachian instinct to run from fire, but the fear wasn't heat. There was no warmth at all, just a visual and auditory assault. I forced myself to my knees, crawling toward the door, each movement sluggish as if the air itself weighed me down. When I opened the door, the hallway was ablaze. Walls, floor, ceiling, all seemed on fire, consuming the wood in a way that defied physics. Bright orange tongues flickered and danced along the banisters, shadows writhing grotesquely. I flinched back, expecting heat, but my skin felt cold, unburned, untouched. I could hear faint whispers carried on the smoke, a susurration I couldn't place, voices just beneath comprehension. I remember shoving against the hall, eyes watering from the smoke, and then it shifted, something beyond explanation. The flames thinned, the smoke dispersed, and the hall was empty, normal, as if the fire had never been there. I stumbled back into my room, slamming the door and collapsing onto the bed, gasping. Sleep didn't come. and when dawn crawled in, I went down for breakfast, finding the inn empty except for the man at the desk. He looked up, expression unreadable, as if he had been expecting me. I wanted to ask what had happened, why the fire had roared in my hallway, but I couldn't find the words. Finally, as I left, he said in that same low, tired voice, "It wasn't the fire you should worry about. It's what gathers around it." I didn't understand. Not then. I drove down the mountain, the fog still thick in the hollows, trying to shake the sensation of being enclosed, watched. Over the next few nights, I noticed small things I couldn't explain. My apartment in the city would sometimes smell faintly of smoke, and the shadows seemed heavier, darker than they should have been. I would see movement out of the corner of my eye, figures flickering in dimly lit rooms, but when I turned, nothing was there. Sometimes, in the corner of a coffee shop or a library, I would glimpse someone staring at me, only to blink and see an empty chair. Months later, I returned to the mountains, compelled to find the Hollow Pines Inn again. The road was familiar, yet the turns were wrong, the hills steeper, the trees closer. It felt like I had been there, but the inn itself was gone, replaced by nothing but a grove of pines and fallen branches. I walked the area, finding faint impressions in the soil, footprints too small and narrow for me, leading toward the remains of a collapsed chimney. The sense of being watched returned with a ferocity I hadn't felt before, and I fled, leaving the mountains behind, unsure if the inn had been real or a mirage conjured by some part of my mind that had been unsettled for years. Still, I can't forget the fire. It's in my dreams, in the flicker of a candle, in the way light plays on walls. Sometimes I hear the low roar, the smoke curling in patterns I swear I recognize, and I think of the man's words, what gathers around it. Sometimes I can't help but look into the dark corners of a room, expecting to see something waiting, something patient. I've spoken to people who know the region, older folks who remember the stories, the mountain fires that never consumed, the lodges that appear and vanish, the whispers that follow travelers back to the lowlands. They tell me to leave it alone, to stay out of the hollows at night, but I can't. Not entirely. The sensation lingers, like a weight I carry without knowing why. I see it in reflections in the windows of my car, in the way the smoke curls from a neighbor's chimney in the winter, in the low, constant hum of wind through trees. I've never been sure if what I saw was a warning, a glimpse of something forgotten in the mountains, or merely my own fear given form. What I do know is that fire never burns the same way in the hollows, and sometimes, when you are alone, it will find you even if you never step foot in the mountains again. I can still hear it sometimes, even now. A soft crackle, a whisper just beyond hearing, the faintest smell of smoke curling through the air without source. I've tried to explain it to friends, to rationalize it as heat inversion, hallucination, the kind of thing that happens when you are tired and hungry and lonely. They look at me with pity or amusement. But I know there is something that gathers around fire, something patient and enduring, something that waits for the people who see it. And when I close my eyes at night, I swear I can see the glow, steady and constant, and I know the hollows have never forgotten me. The mountains keep their own time, their own rules. People vanish, rumors twist through hollows, and lodges appear like dreams you can't quite hold. I have returned in my mind again and again, standing at that lobby, feeling the warmth that should have burned me, listening to the whispers that never made words, and I know I will always remember it. That fire, impossible and cold, that gathered without consuming. I wonder if it waits, patient as stone, for the next traveler foolish enough to follow the road into the pines, for the next person who thinks they can find solitude in a place that doesn't exist, a fire that never dies, and the things that gather around it, watching. Even now, years later, I cannot pass a fire without remembering. Candlelight, hearths, even the flicker of a street lamp. I feel that same pull, the same uncanny, heatless warmth, and I remember the hollow eyes of the innkeeper, the empty hall, and the words, "It wasn't the fire you should worry about, it's what gathers around it." The mountains were patient, the pines taller than they should have been, and the hollows deep and hungry in ways I could never name. I left, but they never truly let me go. I sometimes wake in the night, sweating, the memory vivid, the soft, unrelenting whisper of smoke curling around my bed. I reach out, expecting to touch warmth that isn't there. And in those moments, I understand some things in the mountains never die, never fade, never burn. They wait, quietly, until the next time someone thinks they are alone. I don't know if I should try to forget it, or if forgetting is impossible. The fire is gone, but it has left its mark, and I carry it unbidden wherever I go.